Hey, so yesterday I uploaded a little TikTok talking about my feelings about Star Trek Discovery, and someone said that they wanted to check out Star Trek and they wanted to know if it was worth it to go back to the 60s and watch the original Star Trek, the original series. And I said, yes, absolutely. But I had to acknowledge that maybe I was a little bit too quick to say that. I'm a huge fan of Star Trek, the original series. I'm a huge fan of all of Star Trek. But even I have to acknowledge that while Star Trek the original series has some incredibly high highs, it also has some incredibly low lows. So I thought it might be good for me to do a quick episode guide of all the episodes of Star Trek the original series that I think are worth watching, either because I just think they're really good or because they are important continuity wise going on down the line later on in Star Trek history. I have too many thoughts and too many episodes to talk about in one TikTok, so I'm just going to blast out a whole bunch of TikToks talking about Star Trek episodes from the original series that I think are worth checking out. So if you are interested in seeing this, and if I have uploaded them all already, click on or I don't remember which side it shows up on. Maybe I'm reversed, but like click on the thing on my face and go through, and I'm going to put a caption up at the top that says Star Trek TOS episode guide, and then the name of the episode, and you can click on the different episodes and see exactly what I'm talking about, and see exactly what the episodes are, and see if they're something that you'd like to do. All right, here we go. Right off the bat, one of my favorite episodes of Star Trek the original series, The Cage. It's actually the show's unaired pilot. Yeah, that's what kind of a nerd I am. It was eventually aired, but originally when it was aired, it was cut up into a bunch of little into scenes and then used as flashbacks in an episode of the actual show, a two-parter called The Menagerie. So I guess this is a double recommendation for both The Cage and or The Menagerie. If you're only going to watch one, I don't mind watching both because I love The Cage, so I don't mind watching it twice. But if you're only going to watch one, in order to get the most continuity points, watch The Menagerie. I think The Cage as its own episode holds up better than the two-parter The Menagerie in terms of a story. But The Menagerie is better for continuity because, especially if you are a new Star Trek fan, you've only seen Discovery or the J.J. Abrams Kelvin timeline movies, then watching The Menagerie will help you understand more of what they are talking about in that show, with all the stuff about Captain Pike and the fate that he's eventually going to be involved in, what the hell all that stuff was with the Thelosians in Star Trek Discovery. Menagerie explains more of it than The Cage will, because The Cage was only meant to be a one-off story in this ongoing series they were going to make. When the pilot wasn't picked up and they started making the series with William Shatner as Captain Kirk instead of Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Pike, they were running out of money and they decided, okay, let's make a two-part episode including the scenes from the pilot, so we won't have to shoot a lot of stuff. We'll just have the characters like sitting around talking about the events of this episode. And the way that they chose to slightly alter the events of that story via editing are the events that are considered canon now. And they're not huge changes. You can watch The Cage and then watch Menagerie and not be too confused. But they did subtly change a couple of things, and those have become the accepted canon ideas going forward these days. And those are the canon ideas that were talked about in Discovery and subtly referenced in the Kelvin timeline movies as well. So, I definitely recommend either The Menagerie or The Cage or both. They're all great. The Menagerie is slightly not as good because it is, a flashback episode of a bunch of people talking about, remember that time when, and then you see it. But they're both really good, and I just really recommend them. I love them to pieces. So, the next episode I'm going to recommend from Star Trek the original series is a bit of a hard sell. It's called Charlie X, and the way I would describe the plot is, what if God were an incel? Star Trek has this weird place of being incredibly dated while at the same time being incredibly ahead of its time. And essentially, what this story is about toxic masculinity and how this young man who has, spoilers, godlike abilities is having difficulty growing up. It's essentially like watching that kid from that episode of The Twilight Zone where the little boy has like godlike powers, growing up into a teenager and experiencing puberty and how terrifying that would be. But at the same time, the people are being written by people with horribly backwards attitudes about sex and gender in the 1960s. So not everything is as clear and as progressive as you might want it to be, but I still think it's a very interesting exploration of this idea and a terrifying and very intense story at the end of the day. So I personally love it. I think it's one of the best episodes they ever did. There are some elements that are going to turn a couple of people off. So this one gets a very tacit recommendation from me, a genuine recommendation, but a tacit one because I don't know if maybe I'm a freak and other people aren't going to like this as much as I do. Oh well, it's on the internet now. And now we're getting into the silly shit. Next episode I'm recommending from Star Trek the Original Series is called The Naked Time, and unfortunately because of 1960s censors, not as fun as that sounds. But seriously, the idea is that there's some sort of infection that goes throughout the crew and causes their inhibitions to be lowered. The main reason that I am recommending, well, there are a couple reasons. One, it's an iconic moment in the show because it's the moment George Takei took his shirt off and started running around the ship with a fencing foil, just randomly attacking people and pretending to be D'Artagnan. So, you know, pretty iconic for that. But also, it's probably the single episode that has the most to do with the whole Kirk-Spock ship. I mean, anytime you have a TV show where two male characters express affection or, you know, any kind of love for each other, even just platonic love, people are going to jump on that and make it a sex thing because I guess men still aren't allowed to express emotions to each other without it being a sexual thing. Because toxic masculinity is real even in homosexual spaces, I guess. It's more because Spock, as you probably know if you've seen Discovery or the Kelvin timeline or just because of pop culture osmosis, is a character who keeps his emotions in check. He is dedicated to a philosophy of pure logic and shoving emotion to the side. So when he gets this disease, it causes his emotions to come up. And what is the first thing that he does? Well, when he's infected, it's in the middle of a woman who was infected expressing that she's in love with him. The first thing he does upon getting infected is apologize to this woman saying, I'm sorry, I don't feel the same way. And then he goes out and he finds Kirk, or he goes out and he starts crying. Kirk finds him and he's like, what's wrong, Spock? And he says the line that I already made a TikTok about where he says, Jim, when I feel affection for you, I am ashamed. So, in context, makes sense. But even in context, gay! And I say that with all the love and affection in the world. Gay. So, yeah. Recommended for that alone. Holy shit. Alright, this is where I start recommending episodes only for plot relevance to other episodes in the franchise. If you want to know, if you're a Discovery fan, if you're a fan of later episodes of Star Trek the Original Series, and pretty much nothing else, that's all that this is significant for, or short treks, I guess, then, and you want to see where the character of Harry Mudd came from, the episode of Mudd's Women is for you. If you do not care about seeing his first appearance, stay away. So you may have heard that Gene Roddenberry was this visionary, awesome dude who was way ahead of his time and just a prophet and all this stuff. Truth is, he was a kind of a con artist who was really good at hiring other people to do good work for him, but he himself was someone who was mostly interested in getting his name onto scripts that he didn't write, onto songs that he didn't write, and getting money for stuff he didn't do, and also being a twisted little pervert. One of the few ideas for stories that for Star Trek the original series that was entirely his was this idea he had about women being cargo. He just thought that would be super hot to have women as cargo, and the writer he assigned this idea to write for him had to point out to him that both women as cargo was not a plot, just a vague concept, and also that's just slavery. Gene Roddenberry was offended by this and said, "It's not slavery, it's just women as cargo. Write it. You're a writer, write it. And give me credit for it. Write it for me." So this young writer was like, "Well, I don't know how to fucking... okay, well, so women as cargo, but they're consenting to it, I guess." Which, of course, would make them passengers, not cargo, but whatever. And since I don't know how to make this concept fun as a young writer who's not, like, up on whatever gas Gene Roddenberry is, I guess instead I'll use this character that I was thinking of introducing in some of episodes I was going to write later on, who's like this sort of fun space pirate buccaneer / con artist character named Harry Mudd. So he introduced this character, this beloved icon of the franchise, this fantastic, hilarious character who absolutely makes this episode better in this otherwise incredibly problematic, disgustingly sexist, horribly pervy and horny episode of the original series. So, yeah, that's Mudd's Women. The Corbomite Maneuver might be the most perfect episode of Star Trek in the entire franchise's history, or at the very least, the blueprint episode by which all of Star Trek going forward is based. The writing in this episode is so freaking tight. It's so incredibly good that there are so many lines worth quoting. The most famous one from this episode, famous for a very good reason, is one that Kirk says at the end, towards the end of the episode, when the actual titular Corbomite maneuver finally comes up in the plot. Spock is explaining to Kirk essentially that they are beaten, and that in chess, when one is outmaneuvered, one is finally defeated, and that is what has happened in this situation. And Kirk simply responds, "This isn't chess, Spock. This is poker." TV back in the 60s was not like TV is today. There were no long-running story arcs. There was no master planner, storyteller making sure that all of the episodes wove into this grand tapestry of mythology or anything. Nothing like that. Instead, writers would be hired to write one episode at a time for a grand TV show, and they may not know what TV show they're writing for. They'll be given the briefest idea of what the show is about, who the characters are, and just be told, find a way to write a story about this. There are some episodes in season 1, especially very early on, that I've kind of skipped over, where Captain Kirk is just sort of a generic, big-chinned superhero good guy. Spock is just a generic sidekick to the good guy. But in that one line of Kirk saying, "It isn't chess, it's poker," Kirk encapsulated, whoever this writer is, encapsulated the entire personality and character arc of Captain Kirk, not only in this TV show, not only in this episode, but in this TV show, in the movies, in all of the books, in everything going forward, in an incredibly satisfying way. This episode is so good, and I haven't talked about the plot at all, because I don't want to spoil it for you. It's so good. The ending is a little silly, but it doesn't matter, because the journey, it's all about the journey, man. That's right. This episode turned me into a Lost fan. That's how good it is. Check it out. The Balance of Terror. Now, this is an episode I am recommending because it's very good, but I'm also recommending it because it is absolutely vital, not only to the story of this show going forward, but also to the story of every Star Trek series and every Star Trek movie going forward after it. Essentially, we learn that while the Federation of the future is very peaceful with all the creatures and societies and species that live within it, there are species and societies and different groups of factions of folks that live outside of the Federation, and those people don't always like the Federation. In fact, some of them have even gone to war with the Federation in the past. One of the Federation's oldest enemies, the people known as the Romulans, who the Federation don't have any idea about who they are, what their culture is, what they look like, anything about that, because when they fought, there was no ship-to-ship visual communication. They weren't able to see their faces. The war with the Romulans ended ages past, but now a ship from the Romulan Empire has entered into Federation space using a brand new device called a cloaking device. And now, the secret of the Romulan Empire is about to be revealed. And not only will it shake up things for the Federation going forward, but it's about to very much shake up things for the Enterprise's pointy-eared first officer. One thing I will point out that will become obvious as you watch the episode, the script for this was actually a script that was written by a writer of the week, just a random hire, and he wrote the script with the idea that it would be for some sort of TV show or TV movie about nuclear submarines in the time of the Cold War. When he got picked up to write for Star Trek, he simply used elements of the Star Trek universe, created the idea of the Romulans, and just sort of like tweaked a few things here and there to turn it from a story about submarine battles to spaceship battles. This does create some problems since there is one very important plot point in the episode that involves sound working in space the same way it works underwater, which it famously does not. Doesn't change the fact that this episode is absolutely spectacular and that you should definitely watch it. Check it out. Famously irascible and cantankerous sci-fi author Harlan Ellison once said of Gene Roddenberry that he only had one idea for a story ever, and that story was about people in a spaceship traveling off into the stars, finding God, and learning that he was kind of a prick. I don't know if I can go so far as to say it was the only story that Gene Roddenberry had in him, but it was a story that he seemed particularly fond of because at least 45% of episodes of Star Trek the original series have that plot, as well as at least 2 of the movies. And because this concept is such an integral part of the Star Trek universe, especially for the original series, I feel it behooves me to include the best, in my opinion, the best version of this story, the Squire of Gothos. The idea behind this episode is deceptively brilliant. Yes, on a base level, it is about the crew of the Enterprise going off into space, finding God, and learning that he's a bit of a prick. But on a metatextual level, the kind of prick that this particular God that they meet is a little bit more insidious and interesting than that. You see, a major part of Gene Roddenberry's inspiration for the kind of space show that he wanted to make were the Horatio Hornblower novels. He loved the swashbuckling seafaring adventures of Captain Horatio Hornblower and all that came with. But some of the things that came with were not so good, including the fact that Horatio Hornblower was ostensibly a servant of the British Empire, a famously racist and horrible group. And in this episode, when the crew of the Enterprise meets the Squire of Gothos, they meet someone who is obsessed with that particular era of history, the Horatio Hornblower era of history, and all of the things that come with it, not just the romantic swashbuckling attitude that Gene Roddenberry brought to the Enterprise, but also all of the racism, all of the war, all of the horribly toxic elements that came with that era and that Horatio Hornblower evokes as well. At the end of the day, the episode is about breaking down all of these stupid myths and concepts that we white people have been fed our entire lives about our own history, about manifest destiny, about the pioneer spirit and all this stuff, and breaking it down to what it was always really about: toxic masculinity. It's beautiful, insightful, incredible, and I forgot to even mention that this episode is a comedy and it's hilarious. Check it out. Okay, this one is actually pretty personal to me for kind of a funny reason. I, as you can tell from just me doing this video series, do consider myself a Trekkie. I think that some people prefer to be called Trekkers, but I always heard it say Trekkie, and Trekker doesn't sit right in my mouth, so I go with Trekkie. Some people apparently find that insulting. I don't consider it insulting. I hope that nobody else gets insulted by me calling myself that, but that's what I consider I am. I'm a Trekkie. I'm a Star Trek fan. I have watched Star Trek the original series, every episode, multiple times, including the bad ones, and the ones that like offend me because I'm that much of a completionist. And I have ADHD, which I only realized within the last 2 years, and sometimes I just go through hyperfixations, and Star Trek is a recurring hyperfixation that will come up every couple of months or every couple of years, and I will just mainline the entire original series and a lot of Next Gen and a lot of Deep Space Nine, and just, you know, and I'm in the middle of one of those, which is why these videos are coming out. Anywho, this episode's called the Galileo 7, and the idea is that Spock is put in charge of an away mission. An away mission is when they leave the ship, and they're in the little shuttlecraft, they land on a planet, and they immediately run into trouble, and Spock is put in a situation where he has to make all the command decisions in a very serious life or death situation. The problem is, because the rest of the crew of the ship is all human, and he's an alien, he's Spock, and as a Vulcan, he's someone who only thinks of things in terms of pure logic, or at least he's supposed to. He and the rest of the crew start really butting heads, based on the fact that the rest of the crew thinks that Spock doesn't care if they live or die, when in fact he does, but he's trying to make the most rational and clear-headed decisions that he can, using the logic that he, as a Vulcan, has, as opposed to the sort of more emotional reasoning that they, as humans, have. It's a great episode, but the reason why it is sort of personal to me is because the episode is sort of banking on the idea that you're going to see both sides of this argument on some level. And again, I've watched this episode so many times, and every time, all I came out with was like, Spock's in the right. These guys are being idiots, they're being jerks to Spock. Spock is in the right. Every time, Spock is in the right. And then about a year ago now, I finally learned that I was neurodivergent, and then late last year, I finally rewatched this episode since my diagnosis and realized that me siding entirely with Spock for the entire episode really should have been an indication to me way back when that was the case. So for the Essential Star Trek Episode Guide, I have to clarify, these is for episodes mostly that are very important for character or for storylines going forward, not always episodes that I just consider to be great episodes. There are plenty of episodes I've skipped over for this, like The Return of the Archons or Court Martial. Great episodes, but they don't really add a lot to the universe going forward. If you are simply interested in checking out the episodes of Star Trek the original series that are the most important in terms of plot relevance or building the universe, they're not going to be the most important. Unfortunately, both of those episodes are better than this episode that is important, Space Seed. Space Seed is one of the most important episodes in the entire Star Trek canon because it introduces one of the biggest villains of Star Trek, Khan. Khan Noonien Singh, who has only appeared in the original continuity in this one episode in one movie, but is still a huge force, if only based on Ricardo Montalban's amazing performance as the character in both this and in the movie. Unfortunately, this initial episode that he's in is not the best, but it is definitely worth a watch, even if it wasn't plot relevant, just because of how good Ricardo Montalban is at playing this character. But if I had to be real with you, I would say this episode is one that's mostly important to watch and for plot reasons, not so important to watch for quality reasons. But yeah, so Space Seed is on the list of an absolutely essential Star Trek episode. But if you want something that's a little bit better, if you just care about watching good episodes and not necessarily just plot relevant episodes, I would probably more recommend Return to the Archons, because that episode's creepy as hell and I love it. But, you know, Space Seed, You can still watch Star Trek II Wrath of Khan without seeing Space Seed, but it does make more sense if you've seen Space Seed. So